A question came up at the end of last lesson that I want to kind of address a little bit more, and I want to define a few terms because we're going to be using terms that you and I probably wouldn't agree with as proper terms. One of them is the word hominid, Hominid. Does anybody know what that word means? Hominid. It kind of sounds like human, right? Yeah, man-like. From an evolutionary standpoint, it means humans and their evolutionary ancestors. So that's not a creationist term, is it? Hominid is not, but I'm going to be using that term. So just because I'm using that term doesn't mean I agree with the term. But it's hard to discuss this stuff without using that term. And when you're quoting people that are using the word hominid, that's what now my concept of it is anything from apes to men. They kind of throw everything in there. But that's not exactly what they mean. From a creationist standpoint, there's humans and there's non-humans. And that's it. We didn't evolve from anything else. So they're either human or they're non-human. And we'll use those terms too. But we will throw in the word hominid from time to time. So keep that in mind. Second thing is we'll be using the term paleoanthropology, okay? Paleontologist and paleontology that includes anthropology. The preferred term now is paleoanthropology and a paleoanthropologist. They don't like the old term of just paleologist. They don't like that. Paleontologist, excuse me, because paleo means old, anthropology means the study of man, so they prefer the newer term. But we'll use those interchangeably when we're talking about our subject, paleontology, paleoanthropology. I'll use them interchangeably. The preferred term now is paleoanthropology. And then we'll be talking about dates, okay? When the paleontologist and the paleoanthropologist date things, they date them based upon their own time scale, not a creationist time scale. And you would say, well, why do we accept those dates? Well, we don't accept those dates. But when we're talking about those dates, we're going to use their dates. And there's a reason for that. Just like when we talked about evolution, we talk about evolutionist dates. And here's my point of view. You may not agree with it, but this is my point of view. Is evolution proved if we have infinite amount of time? Does that prove evolution? No, it does not. So do I need short amount of time to prove creation by the same token? So I don't want to use the argument that, because if I start trying to prove creation by saying the earth is only 10,000 years old, then I don't really have any other scientific basis to try to prove it on. And I've kind of lost my audience sometimes when you do that. So we don't accept the dates, but it doesn't matter because the dates are so inconsistent within themselves that we're going to show that there's no evidence of human evolution from the human fossil record and from the hominid fossil record. So if I use the date that this fossil is 3.5 million years old, that doesn't mean I believe it's 3.5 million years old. You get that? I mean, you understand that? I don't accept that date. But we'll be talking about those dates. Or this one's 100,000 years old, this one's 10,000 years old, this is 1.5 million. This is the evolutionist dating system. But their dating system is inconsistent and it even contradicts itself, which is the reason we're going to use their dates. But it doesn't mean we have to accept that or that we do accept it. So just keep that in mind. And I kind of said that at the very beginning of our study, but I probably kind of got lost in the shuffle, and so I'm reiterating that. When we're using these dates, doesn't mean we're accepting the dates, but we will be talking about them, and it'll sound like I'm saying I agree that these things are 3.5 million years old, but I do not. So tonight's topic is going to be on the human fossil record. And I'm going to be taking this from a book called Bones of Contention by Marvin Lubenow. It's an excellent book. It's a very good book. It's kind of technical book. I wouldn't say it's easy reading necessarily, but if you're really, really interested in it, it's a very scholarly book. He is not a paleoanthropologist, I'll tell you that right now, but he's a kind of a self-made paleoanthropologist, if you will. But he's very, very scholarly book, and I highly recommend it if you really have an interest in it. And what we're going to be talking about is just a fraction of what's in that book. Most of what we'll be talking about, though, is from that book, and I'll give him credit for that, right now. Some of it comes from Jonathan Wells, some of it comes from other places. But Marvin Lubenow will be referring to his book frequently. And we'll be talking about the ultimate icon of evolution. This is a term, you remember Jonathan Wells wrote the book Icons of Evolution, and in his book he calls this the ultimate icon of evolution. Because, have you seen this picture before? Who hasn't seen this picture? Now this one has how many individuals in it? 6. You'll see some that have 12 or 13. It doesn't really matter. They all start with a bent over animal that's walking on its knuckles, that's all hairy, that nobody would deny is probably a chimpanzee or something like that. And then it becomes more bipedal as it advances through quote unquote evolution. It becomes more upright. The skull changes in appearance. It becomes a little bit bigger, a little bit more room for a brain, a little more capacity, if you will, for a brain. And then you've got the second to the last guy, which I would have a hard time distinguishing that from a human being. But the last guys clearly are what we would call a modern human. And this is in most every textbook. It's in National Geographics. You'll see it sometimes displayed as a poster at schools. And this is the ultimate icon. The problem with this ultimate icon, it is purely fictional. It is purely fictional. And it has no basis in reality. And I'll tell you another little secret you're going to find out in this class. Even evolutionists don't buy this icon anymore. They take some people out of this, specifically to give you a little heads up, Neanderthal man. They want to take him out of that icon. They don't want him in there because that would be racist if he was there. And you'll find out why when we finish talking about this. But this parade is purely fictional. There's no basis in reality. This is the figment of the imagination. That's what it is. Problem is the fossil records primarily serve evolutionists. What do I mean by that? Well, it means they're going to look at those fossil records and they're going to interpret them from an evolutionary point of view. And they're going to place these individuals, these fossil records, these remains, they're going to place them in a way that makes sense evolutionary. Okay? That's what they're going to do because they've already bought the fact that evolution is fact, and we've seen why scientists do that. So you can interpret these records, you can put them in an order that you want to, but that doesn't mean your order is correct, and that's what they do. The point is, and we'll find out in this class, that there are no compelling transitional states or missing links. The proverbial missing link. We're always looking for the missing link, and that missing link, I can tell you heads up right now, has not been found. There are ancient primates that have been found. Not going to deny that. There are ancient primates that have been found. Probably some primates that are now extinct. So what? The mastodon's extinct too, but I would put him in the elephant family, wouldn't you? The saber-toothed tiger is extinct. I don't see any saber-toothed tigers now, but you know what? He's still a cat. Okay? So an ancient primate that's no longer around doesn't mean that they evolved into human beings. They were ancient primates that are extinct now. Thankfully for us, we're still around. So there are a few things to keep in mind when we're going to be talking about this. And this is kind of an interesting one that Lubenow breaks out. And that is these fossil fragments are treated almost as they're sacred. Try to look at these fossil records. Even if you're a paleoanthropologist, at some very prestigious university, try to actually look at these. You can't. They keep them in vaults. Now you'll get to look at the plaster cast. They'll show you a plaster cast, but try to look at the actual bones. It is just basically impossible, and they are treated that way. They're guarded. I mean, these are important, and they treat them that way. I don't. You decide why they do that. I guess they're afraid that some crazy creationist may get in there and abscond with these fossils, therefore disproving evolution, which is a bunch of baloney, obviously. We don't need that, but that's the way these fragments are treated. You would think they were the part of the cross of Jesus or something that some of our religious friends try to say they have. We were in France a few weeks ago, and supposedly, I think it was, I forget the cathedral, it might have been Notre Dame, I'm not sure. No, I know what it was. It was the Chapelle Cathedral, where they built that because of the ancient relics that supposedly had a piece of the cross. Of course, you can't find that now. That's the way these fossils are treated. Some of the fossils, they're long gone. They don't have them anymore. You will never see the actual fossil record because it is gone. All you have left is a plaster cast. Now, is the plaster cast accurate or not? Who knows? But they're gone. They're not there. And the fossils can be arranged, as I've already alluded to, the fossils can be arranged in an alternative method. We would arrange them differently than the evolutionists would, and there would be no reason not to. It doesn't follow that they have to be arranged the way that the paleoanthropologists, evolutionists like to do it. I like this quote from Lubenow. He said, "No prisoner on death row is under greater scrutiny than those ancient relics called human fossils." They are well guarded. And again, that's just something to keep in mind. Here's the other thing. Go back mentally to that picture that we showed on, well, I'll just go back to it real quick because it's not too far away. Go back to this picture. Well, clearly, you think when they found some of these fossils that they were able to discern just from the bones that that's what these creatures look like with their hair and their eyebrows and with their features and all that? Well, of course not. So my point is, get back to where we were, reconstruction of these fossils always go beyond what could be intelligently derived simply by looking at the skeletal remains. They just do. They get the artist rendition, I guess you could say. That's what you get. So when you see pictures, when you see the icons, they're not based on reality. And we're going to show how ludicrous this is in just a second. Jonathan Wells in his book, Icons of Evolution, he gives a good example of just how silly this is. Now, what he did was, there was a recent National Geographic magazine, and they had commissioned 4 artists to reconstruct a female figure from cast of 7 fossil bones thought to be from the same species of a skull that they gave the number 1470, which represented a skull that was discovered in Kenya, studied by guys like Richard Leakey. I know everybody's heard of the Leakeys, Michael Day and Alan Walker. So this was what the commission was. Now, Cherry tried to reprint this picture. National Geographics won't let you. You know, the copyright laws and all that. We couldn't do that. You can go online and see these 4 different pictures. But here's the deal. They commissioned 4 different artists. Do you think they all look the same? No, they didn't. One artist drew a creature whose forehead is missing and whose jaws look vaguely like those of a big dinosaur. Another artist drew a rather good-looking modern African-American woman with unusually long arms. A third drew a somewhat scrawny female with arms like a gorilla and a face like a Hollywood werewolf. And the fourth drew a figure covered with body hair and climbing a tree with beady eyes that glare out from under a heavy gorilla-like brow. Any one of them look the same. So that's what you get when you get these quote-unquote reconstructions. You probably know all this, but I'm just letting you know that that's just the way it is. Problem is, school children don't know this. That's the problem. So when they go in 7th or 8th grade or 6th grade or whenever, I don't know when evolution is begun to be taught. One of the school teachers in here can tell me maybe. But somewhere along the line, when they get into biology in high school, for sure, it starts to be taught, and probably even sooner. They see these pictures. They don't know that they're reconstructions. They think they're real. They see these icons and they believe they're real. And that's what's concerning. A lot of adults the same way, but we are educated in this class and we know better. They're reconstructions. This, by the way, is skull 1470. I mean, how could you draw someone's arms based upon that skull? I mean, how would you know how long their arms are? I don't know. And all the other things that go with it. And of course, the other obvious thing to keep in mind is that paleontologists assume the evolution of man. The reason that's important, and we're going to see this, if not tonight, then in next week's lesson, in Sunday's lesson, is so if they find a bone that they date very recent, where are they going to put that on the evolutionary scale? Early or late? Late, obviously. Why? Because evolution's true, and that creates a problem for them. So if someone comes along and sees someone that predates Australopithecus, afarensis, predates it, but if, from a skeletal point of view, but they date it 1,000 years later, or in some cases 1,000,000 years later, they've got to interpret it based upon that date, if they believe that date. And so they assume evolution to be true. So anything they find has to fit into that. Also, similarity equals evolution. So if you have a similarity of a being, then that means evolution. And we've already looked at that in this class. That's our old homology argument. Similarity does not equal evolution. It could equal a common designer. Here's a true fact, Marvin Lubinall once again. A series of objects created by humans or God can be arranged in such a way as to make them look as if they had evolved when in fact they were created independently by an intelligent being. And that's just the fact. You can put them in that order. It's like looking at, once again, our old example. Remember the Corvette? And the 1955 Corvette and the 60 and the 70 and so forth. And you can arrange those and it can look like, oh, well, look at that. It evolved from there to there. We know that wasn't true. It was a common designer. And you can do that with these. Here's the problem that we talked about. Fossils are selectively excluded if they do not fit well into the evolutionary scheme. If they don't fit, remember the old thing, if the glove don't fit, you got to quit. Well, if the fossil don't fit, you got to do something with it. Get rid of it or change it and put it at a different date. Some fossils are arbitrarily downgraded to make them appear to be evolutionary ancestors when they are true humans. In other words, if you got the corollary to what I mentioned just a minute ago, let's say you've got something that looks very human, but it's dated 3.5 million years. Where are you going to put that one in the evolutionary scale? You're going to have to put it very early if it's 3.5 million years. And that's what they do. They arbitrarily do that. So they will downgrade to make them appear to be evolutionary ancestors when they were in fact true humans. And in some non-human fossils are upgraded to make them appear to be human ancestors. Marvin Lubinall calls it waving the magic wand. Paleontologists like to do that. So there's a myth here. The myth in the minds of the public, this is a quote from Marvin Lubinall's book, is that human fossil material is readily available and is thoroughly studied by all who teach and write on the subject. That's just not true. The truth is, paleoanthropology is in an awkward position of being a science that is several steps removed from the very evidence upon which it claims to base its findings. So you think paleoanthropology or paleontology is a hard, fast science. It's just a mistake to think that. It's just not. It's not like chemistry or some of the other hard sciences we have. And as Carl Sagan, he didn't mean it in this way, but I've kind of taken his quote a little bit out of context. Not all scientific statements are of equal weight. Here's another interesting thing. We talked about this either last week or the time before. And it's whenever they make the discoveries, they always make the headlines, don't they? Remember when Lucy was discovered? Are y'all, remember that? We'll talk about Lucy later on, either tonight or Sunday. Every time one of these fossil remains is discovered, it is, as Andrew Hill of Yale University says, it's the most important one found ever, and it solves all of our known phylogenetic problems. I mean, every time they find one, it's like that. Every new hominid specimen is completely different from all the previous ones, no matter how similar. They're going to find the differences. Every new hominid species is a new species and probably a new genus, and therefore they got to give it a new name. That's just how ridiculous the science of paleontology has become. Compared to other science, this is kind of an understatement. Compared to other sciences, the mythic element is greatest in paleoanthropology. It just is. And there's ways in which it's hard to say it's a science, but we call it that. And here's a problem. Other scientists can communicate with other scientists, but if you're not a paleontologist, you have no right to argue with them. And I like the way Milford Woolpeth put it. When the only people who can comment are discoverers or friends of the discoverers, there is no sense of independent observer. We are not practicing science, we are practicing opera. Now, I don't know how you practice opera, but you see what I'm saying with that statement? You can't argue with me. Only somebody real familiar with the paleontology, my friends in essence, they have a right to argue with me, but you have no right. And that's not pure science when it gets to be that point. You're really not. We can understand some of the sciences. You don't have to be a PhD in chemistry to understand some of the chemistry. You just don't. You can talk about it with other chemists. Same thing in biology and other things. But paleontology is sort of a different bird. You can't argue with them if you don't have, you're not friends of them. So an independent observer cannot do it. Now this was really interesting that Lubenow has in his book, and also Jonathan Wells mentions Messiah Landau. Messiah Landau wrote a book called The Narratives of Human Evolution, and she is a paleontologist, so she has the credentials to do this. And she maintained that many classic texts in paleoanthropology were determined as much by traditional narrative frameworks as they are by material evidence. This is typical. Like the typical story is showing human ancestors moving from trees to ground and then developing upright posture, acquiring intelligent language, and developing technology in society. And it far exceeds what can be inferred from the study of fossils alone, and in fact places a heavy burden on the interpretation of the fossil record, a burden which is relieved by placing fossils in pre-existing narrative structures. This is, again, someone of the field making this statement. And so it just, you get these stories. That's what they are. They're just stories. You can't discern their stories just by looking at these fossil bones, but that doesn't keep them from doing it. And that's what happens in paleoanthropology. She has recognized, Ms. Landau, the similarities between the stories of human evolution and the stories of folk tales or hero myths of literature, kind of like Beowulf. Remember the story of Beowulf? That's kind of the archetypal hero in English literature. And the same thing goes with the story of paleontology. And she's looked at that, and they're very, very similar in the way the stories go. And I've condensed this quite a bit for Ms. Landau. But there's an initial condition of the hero. We're going to have our archetypal hero. Now, our hero in this case is who? You know, humans, in the evolution of human beings. And so, at first, our hero in our scenario is helpless and defenseless. In this case, it's a primate living in a tree. In another archetype of hero, it's another scenario, but they're helpless when they begin. Then circumstances changes where the hero develops a more upright bipedal structure and a larger brain. In our scenario, the hero then becomes tested by predators in a harsh climate. The result is a transformation, and the hero acquires increasing intelligence and tools. And finally, the hero is tested yet again. And this is just true of any hero story, but it fits with the paleontology story. And then they become full-fledged humans when they're finally tested yet again. And guess what? In the anthropologist story, the hero will succumb eventually. Guess how the human species will succumb eventually in the anthropology story? We're going to kill ourselves with our own technology. And this is not atypical, but it's brilliant observation by Ms. Landau. There's some, if I haven't said there's misconceptions already, well, there's a few more misconceptions you need to understand. And this is a big one. Probably the biggest misconception is that there are relatively few fossils. How many believe there's just a whole lot of these fossil records out there to study? Yeah, you don't have to show your hands, I guess, but how many believe there's just very few to study? Well, there's actually quite a few. There's probably at least 4,000. Okay, so these are they're not few specimens. There's a lot of specimens. The myth is that there's not. And here's the reason the myth is they're not. When workers in the field speak of the scarcity of human fossils, what they're really actually saying, and this comes from Lubenow, is that although there is an abundance of said human fossils, most of them are either too modern or are either too modern to help them, or they don't fit well in the evolutionary scheme. That's what they really mean. When they say there's few fossil records, they mean there's few that fit their scheme the way they want them to fit. But Lubenow in his book, if you get it, in the back of his book, he lists all the fossil remains, you know, and where they're at this time, all of the ones that we know about. And if you add that list up, it's something on the order of about 4,000. So there are quite a few to look at. Now, you're not going to see the original ones, but and these are, a lot of them are fragments, granted, maybe a tooth, maybe a piece of a skull cap, fully human our early human, from an evolutionary point of view, a skeleton is virtually non-existent, but you have pieces that you can find, and there's quite a few of them. And there's another misconception. And this misconception is that science is self-correcting. Okay, we may be wrong for a short time, but don't worry about it. Eventually science gets it right and we self-correct. And so you got all these anthropologists and paleontologists and all this looking at bones, and there may be a little bit of disagreement about it, but eventually we'll get it right. What that basically means really is we're going to shuffle things around so they eventually fit the way we want them to fit. That's what they really mean by that. But they say science is self-correcting. Well, you've heard this. You've heard of our fellow named Piltdown. You remember who Piltdown was? This was a case that a guy by the name of Charles Dawson in 1908. And the reason I put two dates there is he discovered part of the skull in 1908, and then a mandible or two supposedly later in 1915. And this has occurred in an area called Piltdown. That's hence the name Piltdown man in Sussex, England. And he put together one of the first supposedly missing links, and it was lauded by everybody. You know, it was in all the magazines. And Piltdown man, we have found the true missing link, because the skull, you know, kind of looked semi-human, and he put it together, but it wasn't quite human. It was kind of in between human and an ape, and hence we have our famous Piltdown man. However, and look at the dates. This was 1908 when the first specimen was found, and the last specimen was 1915. For several decades, if you read a textbook on paleoanthropology, you're going to read about Piltdown man. Nobody was checking to see if it was real until 38 to 45 years later, depending on where you put those first two dates. And they discovered that, guess what? It was a fraud. Piltdown man was not real. They had a skull cap of possibly a human, but the other remains were animals that had been placed there, and even the tools that they found were placed there. It was a complete fraud. So to say it's self-correcting, okay, it was self-correcting, but it took how many years to do it? 40 years? So who knows what they're telling us now won't be found to be something different later on. So, okay, you can argue whether it's correcting or not, but I'd say it's not always correcting. Now, how about falsification? What do we mean by falsification? What is true of any scientific theory? Anybody want to venture an opinion on this? Well, in order to have a scientific theory, you have to be able to falsify it, or at least have an experiment that would have the ability to falsify it. And if you can't falsify it, then you may have something. Like, for example, the theory of relativity. In the early 1900s, early part of the 20th century, relativity was discovered by Einstein. And since that time, there have been numerous, if not thousands, of theories to try to falsify relativity. There has never been one yet to do it. That's why scientists believe that's the way the universe works. Relativity is the way the universe works. We've never had a scientific experiments that have been able to falsify it. So you need to have a way to falsify something, or an experiment that could falsify something, and the same is true in paleoanthropology. A worthy scientific theory must be capable of being falsified. And since human evolution is a historic process, the falsification has to come from where? The fossils. That's the only way you're going to falsify it. So it must come from the fossil record. So there has to be a way to falsify, or at least a scientific test that, if it were found to be true, would falsify it. 1974, Don Johnson. I'm going to go how this works, and you'll see why it's impossible to falsify paleontology. Impossible. 1974, Don Johansen in Ethiopia discovered a supposed 3 million old female fossil he described as the oldest ancestor. Again, always goes back, it's always the oldest, and named it Lucy. Lucy was supposedly the product of 5 million mutated events in 3 million years. By the way, on evolutionary time frame, 5 million mutated events can't occur in 3 million years. That ain't enough time on the evolutionary time frame. So you have to have punctuated evolution for this to occur. But that's what, and I remember this, 1974 wasn't that long ago. I was actually in college at that time, and I remember Lucy being paraded. Do y'all remember, anybody remember Lucy? Yeah, remember that? There's Lucy. I think I saw a picture on National Geographic back in 1974, shortly thereafter. And that's a really, you don't get the picture there, but it's a very short organism, or short animal, or being. Let's just call it being right now. I don't know what to call her. She's a being. Now, similar skeletal findings were also found, and these became known as Australopithecus afarensis. Now, I want you to understand that how old is Lucy? 3 million years. 3 million years, right? 3 million years. Now, later on, T.C. Partridge discovered another kissing cousin to Lucy. They didn't name her Australopithecus afarensis, it was Australopithecus africanus. Very similar in structure, probably undistinguishable, but found differently. And here's the other thing that was completely different. How old is Australopithecus africanus on this slide? 870,000 years. That's over 2 million years difference, right? For species that look very, very similar, even given similar names. Well, what do paleontologists do with that data? They say, well, T.C. Partridge's, his fossils are nonconformist. They don't fit. Nonconformist means they don't fit with my theory. The date's too early. Now, I don't buy 108. I'm not saying I buy the 870,000 years. This is the paleontologist dating, though. That's what they dated. And here's a picture of Australopithecus africanus and the skull that they found. And since then, they have found other bone fragments and skulls of both these, afarensis and africanus. So what do the evolutionists do to deal with this apparent conflict? Because it is a conflict, is it not? Pretty big conflict. If you got 2.5 or over 2 million years difference between something that's very similar. Well, once again, the fossils were upgraded. We're going to call them something different. They're not Australopithecus africanus. We're going to call them Homo habilis. Even Homo sounds closer to Homo sapiens, doesn't it? And it puts them closer in the evolutionary time scale. Even if you looked at the fossil record, you wouldn't do that. And it's called, like I say, Lubenow calls it waving their magic wand. And that's what they do. And that's what they had to do. Because otherwise, they got a major conflict. And that's what Homo habilis looks like. Now, that's again the artist rendition of that. Now, this is apparently a male version. There's our female version of africanus, and that's our, I'm going the wrong direction, and that's afarensis. And these are all based upon artist rendition. So now we've got a totally different category called Homo habilis. So again, it becomes impossible to falsify a theory when scientists can change their beliefs in midstream. You cannot falsify that anymore. And like Lubenow says, it's like trying to nail jelly to a wall. You're just not going to win. So we have to look at it from our own perspective, not expecting them to come to reality, seriously, because they're going to interpret this data from an evolutionary point of view. Oldest human fossil. Now this is Lubenow, and he looked at the human fossil, and it's called KNM/KP/271. All these letters stand for where they were found and the specimen that was found. So this one was found near Lake Rudolph in Kenya at Kanapi, and hence the K's in there and so forth. And this was supposedly 3.5 million years old. The fossil is shaped exactly like a Homo sapien. But because it's aged 3.5 million years, what is it? It's an Australopithecus. Simply because of their aging of that bone. Not because of the way it's looked. So they wouldn't call it a human fossil. That's Lubenow calling it that. They wouldn't call it that. Oh, that's just some bone fragments that were found. That's KNP. That is the bone fragments of KNM KP271. So here's the truth of the matter. Australopithecus afarensis, Australopithecus africanus were not human at all, but they really represent extinct primates. One of them extinct by evolutionary dates not that long ago. And we're going to see data. We've already seen that we have skeletal remains of humans that look just like human fossils that date 3.5 million.